All right, this video lecture begins our unit of class devoted to a topic in applied ethics. Applied ethics is that branch of ethics that deals with concrete and controversial ethical problems and topics, dilemmas, and conundrums. And the first set of controversial applied ethical topics that we'll be considering are the meaning of violence and nonviolence in social struggle, and in particular, the morality of violence and nonviolence in social struggle, and the strategy of violence and nonviolence in social struggle. And our first reading that addresses these topics is entitled, "When Birmingham Became Ungovernable, How a Riot in Alabama Produced Civil Rights Legislation." So this means we're going to spend our time today considering a riot. And it's a riot that you've probably never heard of. Not to suspect you of knowing a lot about riots, but we know of a few of them. And this is one you've never heard of, and I can just about guarantee that you'll probably never hear of it again. It has been almost totally erased from history. But nonetheless, the Birmingham riot was incredibly impactful on American history, perhaps just as impactful as the Stamp Act riots and the Boston Tea Party. Now, the revolt, or the uprising, which are more accurate words than riot, was a two-day explosion of rage and rebellion and political vandalism in Birmingham, Alabama on May 11th and 12th of 1963. And the rebellion occurred at the conclusion of the nonviolent Birmingham campaign, which we've addressed already when examining the texts Religious Leaders Called for Unity and Martin Luther King Jr.'s text, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And in those discussions, we addressed how King's strategy of nonviolence and nonviolent resistance worked. So think back to those lectures. What were the two things that nonviolent resistance needed in order to be a tactically effective tool of disobedience? Well, first, it required violence, right? It required violence from the state. It needed state violence. And secondly, it required, in response to that state violence, a rejection of self-defense, right? It required non-retaliation from the nonviolent protester. Now, King's nonviolent strategy during the Civil Rights Movement was meant to reveal before the moral conscience of the country the stark moral contrast between the forces of liberation and the forces of oppression. In King's words, the strategy of nonviolence was to create and foster such a tension in society and in the conscience of the individual that they could not ignore oppression, but would rather have to choose a side in the ongoing social and political movement, the side of liberation or the side of oppression and status quo. This was the strategy of moral persuasion. Now, of course, the nonviolent strategy had been unsuccessful for most of the Birmingham campaign. It has been unsuccessful up to this point, where King is actually writing from jail his letter from a Birmingham jail. And so King's very worried that nonviolence was going to fail here in Birmingham, just as it failed in Albany, Georgia 8 months earlier. The police chief in Albany, Georgia was a man named Laurie Pritchett. And Pritchett had read Martin Luther King Jr.'s works. He had read Gandhi, and Pritchett comprehended the strategy of nonviolence. And he knew that if he refused to use violence against protesters, he could deprive the protest movement of those images of racist violence, of the state brutalizing protesters in the streets. He could neutralize their strategy of nonviolent resistance. In other words, if he could sort of out nonviolence the nonviolence protesters, which is exactly what he does. He successfully neutralizes the nonviolent strategy in Albany. So this is what you have to understand. It wasn't the racist bad cop, but rather the good cop who was the most effective in upholding Jim Crow white supremacy, right? Not the Bull Connor but the Laurie Pritchett. And in his open letter to the clergy, King describes his indignation with the actions of the good cop in both Albany and in Birmingham, writing, "I have tried to make it clear that it's wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends," right? Using, in his words, violence to achieve desegregation. But now, King continues, right? "But now I must affirm that it's just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends," right? To use a sort of nonviolent policing in order to preserve Jim Crow segregation. Perhaps Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather nonviolent in public, as was Chief Pritchett in Albany, Georgia, but they have used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of racial injustice. Here's the civil rights journalist Claude Sitton discussing Laurie Pritchett.
Perhaps the worst enemy that a civil rights movement ever encountered was a police chief named Laurie Pritchett in Albany, Georgia. Not because he was stupid and brutal and did the things that Connor did in Birmingham, but because he was very sharp and intelligent in his tactics and his actions. And what he did was to strictly enforce segregation without creating the kind of furor that Washington would hear about and react to. As a matter of fact, Pritchett was praised by Bobby Kennedy and others in Washington because he had kept the peace.
So, similarly in Birmingham, the police are demonstrating restraint and trying to, quote unquote, keep the peace. Of course, when you hear that, you want to think the negative peace that King discusses, which is merely the absence of tension, peace and quiet, as opposed to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So that's what's going on now in Birmingham, right? But the situation is about to change. What happens and why? Think about the text. So there are no more adults in Birmingham who are willing to protest. So what happens are that the children are taken out of school, take themselves out of school often, and they decide that they're going to lead the marches. And by day 2 of this children's crusade, as it was called, the jails in Birmingham are overflowing. And without a place to put the demonstrators, the police will have to turn to brute violence in order to clear the streets and disperse the movement. So the police and the fire department, both under the control of Bull Connor, have these high-pressure water hoses, these water cannons that are capable of peeling the bark off of trees, and they use them on teenagers, people your age and much younger. And they spray them across city intersections like they are rag dolls. And they sick dogs onto children. So the nation sees these images, and they are outraged. But this was precisely the strategy of nonviolence. First, you fill the jails, and then you lure out the barbaric racist violence of the state, and you put that violence on display before the whole country. The 2014 film Selma is one of the few films and popular media depictions that actually address the strategic function of nonviolence, right? Where the protesters were actually hoping, right, and needing the state to be violent.
Roy Reed of the New York Times.
Yes, hello to you. How are you?
I'm well, sir. Thank you for asking. Dr. King, are you truly nonviolent if you're provoking violence, sir?
We are here using our very bodies in protest to say to those who deny us that we will no longer let them use their billy clubs in dark corners and halls of power. We make them do it in the glaring light of day, Mr. Reed.
Is Snick standing with us on this or not,
You want us to bring our people in, but you're not giving anything in return. Now, we are asking for some kind of commitment
Respectfully, speaking of course, we've been handling the voter registration in this town now for 2 years.
Well, you haven't gotten very far, have you?
Well, maybe not, Reverend, but we're still here.
Meaning what?
This time next month, you won't be.
That's insanity.
Just like you left Albany.
Oh,
Those people are pathetic down there now, like their daddy left home.
Hey, what we're trying to explain is that in Albany,
You know what I think? Maybe we should just leave Selma. Now, leave it to these two. Come back in another 2 years and see how much further you got.
Sounds just fine to me.
That's enough. Enough of this now. I haven't enough time for this. None of us got the time for this. John, James, the way our organization works is straightforward. We negotiate, we demonstrate, we resist. And on our best days, our adversary helps the matter by making a mistake. Now, we were in Albany for 9 months, and we made a lot of mistakes. But their sheriff, Laurie Pritchett, he never made a mistake. Kept his cool, kept arresting us in a humane way, carried people to the jail wagons on stretchers, day in, day out. There was no drama.
You mean there was no cameras?
Exactly. Now, I know we all understand that you young people believe in working in the community long term, doing the good work to raise black consciousness. It's good grassroots work. I can't tell you how much we admire that. But what we do is negotiate, demonstrate, resist. And a big part of that is raising white consciousness. And in particular, the consciousness of whichever white man happens to be sitting in the Oval Office. Right now, Johnson has other fish to fry, and he'll ignore us if he can. The only way to stop him doing that is by being on the front page of the national press every morning, by being on the TV news every night. And that requires drama. Now, John, James, answer me one question. I've been told the sheriff in this town didn't like Laurie Pritchett in Albany. He's a big, ignorant bully, like Bull Connor in Birmingham. Well, you tell me. You know Selma. You know Sheriff Jim Clark. Is he Laurie Pritchett? Or is he Bull Connor?
He's Bull Connor.
Bingo!
Good. That's good. But it gets better.
I mean, it's a really sort of profound indication of the degree of courage that King and other civil rights nonviolent resistors had to demonstrate when they are actually, excited and enthused to discover that Jim Clark, right, the head of the police in Selma, Alabama, is a lot like Bull Connor, the racist barbarian in Birmingham, because it knows, they know that means he's going to overreact, right, or that he is going to brutalize people in the streets. Now, after the images of Bull Connor and the police using water cannons on children, after those images spread across the country, Birmingham's economic leaders come to the negotiating table and agree to the movement's demands. On May 10th, King proclaims a truce, and it's a great victory for the civil rights movement, the victory for desegregation in Birmingham, Alabama. But the next day, on May 11th, something truly catastrophic occurs. The police and the KKK attempt to assassinate Martin Luther King and his brother, A.D. King. They place bombs at the Gaston Motel, where King had been staying, and they firebomb A.D.'s home. Now, King is fine. He left the town the night before, and A.D. and his family are also okay, except for the fact that a bomb exploded in their home, but they escaped out the back. Now, immediately after the explosion, hundreds of black residents take to the streets. The crowd eventually grows into the thousands, but they aren't coming out to march and sing gospel songs and hold hands and offer up their bodies as nonviolent resistors to be brutally beaten by the police and white mobs, right? No, no, no. They've come to fight back. They've come to drive the police out of their neighborhoods. And they aren't being pacified by the religious leaders, including King, who has come back to Birmingham and is now urging everyone to remain peaceful and return home. And so some of the emotion that's going on through people that take to the streets to attack the police and destroy property and what we look at as riots, to try to get inside of the consciousness of the people who are using this as a tool is difficult to do. But there was a documentary that was released, 10 years ago from people who participated in the Watts Rebellion, a riot in Alabama that was 2 years after Birmingham. And their reflection on that moment can be helpful for us.
We were throwing rocks at police who were in the street, and they were taking position up behind their cars and firing. And I said, damn, they're shooting at us.
Cops have weapons and they had a law behind them. The citizens don't have anything behind them but their own heart, their own desire, their own determination, and they're really fighting to survive.
And you cannot whoop us. We're already dead. We're already beaten down. We've been beaten down for 400 years. We already got the wounds inside and outside our bodies. How you gonna hurt us? You cannot threaten us. You cannot frighten us. We live in the most frightening places, under the most frightening conditions. We are immune to fear. We are immune to harm. You see what I'm saying? You have stepped into a cesspool. You're the only one gonna get infected.
I think that we must stay off the streets. I think the civil rights drive in America has demonstrated that violence will never be the just end to the grievances we have.
But cutting through a call for order came a voice that only the night before was raised by thousands in the street.
See, and I'm going to tell you something. Tonight is going to be another one, whether you like it or not. No, wait. Listen. We, the Negro people down here, have gotten completely fed up with what's there.
So, over the course of 2 nights, May 11 and May 12, black rebels in Birmingham burned cop cars, pelted police with bricks and bottles and fists, set fire to a few white-owned properties, and generalized acts of vandalism and looting across 9 whole city blocks. And as far as the looting goes, remember, these folks are living in desperate poverty. And it was a poverty that was designed by economic structures for them. As Martin Luther King noted in the booklet we read much, much earlier this semester, The Racial Ignorance of White America, King notes that the sort of segregation economy created this standing reserve of impoverished and exploited and underpaid black workers. It created a racialized underclass of people who were largely immobile and confined to poverty-stricken areas. And there's only a certain amount of jobs they could have. So they were kept in poverty. And it's looking at the riot, it's difficult to underestimate just how historically significant the Birmingham Rebellion is. In 80 years of Jim Crow terror and subjugation, nothing like this had ever really happened before. Birmingham men and women shot through history like a meteor, waging the first insurrection against Southern white supremacy since the antebellum slave revolts of the 1800s. But knowledge of this event has sort of been stolen from us. And so the significance of the uprising, which would otherwise be recognized immediately, must be spelled out explicitly. So Jim Crow police, as we've learned, had oppressed and terrorized blacks in the South with impunity and had done so for generation after generation, paralyzing Southern black communities with fear and trauma. But now, for the first time in history of the Jim Crow South, Black Americans had launched a spontaneous attack against that institution which had enforced the white supremacist social order, and they did it using nothing but rocks and bottles and bricks and fists and bravery. And so the entire country, the rest of the United States, was looking at this, and they were receiving a message written with fire and smoke. Black Americans, who had been living and dying under the terror of the Jim Crow social order and the Jim Crow police state, would not remain peaceful forever. And so let's think on the applied ethical question here. Can this sort of riotous violence and property destruction ever be morally justified or even morally praiseworthy? Right? Were the rebels demonstrating morally praiseworthy qualities, right? Like bravery and courage. I have a view on that, but I just want you to think about it really reflectively and let it challenge your assumptions, because it's not a particularly normal view of things to suggest that people who engage in something like a riot, right, are ever morally justified. But let yourself feel challenged by the question nonetheless. And if you feel uncomfortable praising the rioters as brave and courageous, it's important that you ask yourself whether you feel that same discomfort when considering the actions of the Sons of Liberty during the Boston Tea Party or the actions of the colonists who waged the very effective Stamp Act riots. Do you feel that same hesitancy to look at them and say, yeah, they were brave and courageous and their actions were praiseworthy, despite the fact they were waging riots and engaging in property destruction as a tactic of revolt? And so when we think about the Jim Crow social order and the world that Black Americans were up against here in the 60s, we know that the Jim Crow system wasn't just a system of prejudice and discrimination. It was far more than that, right? It was a regime of non-white humiliation and white terror. Every square inch of reality was a social prison that said no, right? No, you can't eat here, you can't shop here, you can't walk here, you can't go to school here, you can't raise a family here, you can't work here, you can't vote here, you can't serve on a jury here. Your life isn't valuable. That's the message you receive if you're Black. Your life doesn't matter. So again, to try to get inside and activate our imagination, to get inside of the consciousness of people who are facing down this reality, we can watch another clip from people reflecting on their experience of the Watts riot, again, which was just 2 years after the Birmingham Rebellion.
In a free society, I'm walking down the street, police got the nerve to ask me, where you going? Where you coming? Ain't none of your damn business where I'm going. And ain't none of your damn business where I came from. Fuck you talking about where you going? He gonna ask me, what are you doing here? You go anywhere and ask anybody else what they doing there? You stop and ask anybody else in this society, man, why do you exist? You understand what I'm saying? But you got the nerve to ask me that all day, every day. Now, what do you think that does to me psychologically? What does that tell me? What message am I being fed every day? See, you don't understand that every day he's feeding me a spoonful of hatred. Every day, that's my diet, a spoonful of hatred. You see? And it's just a question of when is this going to erupt? And upon whom is it going to erupt? Am I going to attack myself? Am I going to attack my brother? You understand? Am I going to attack my own image in the mirror? Or am I going to eventually attack the cause of my anger and my frustration? But the point is, I'm a walking time bomb. I'm going to go off someday, somewhere, on somebody. The question is, upon whom?
So Jim Crow was this social prison, and the prison had guards, and those guards were the police. They were the first and last line of defense for Jim Crow, because they were the first on the scene to use violence to remove a Black person from a white neighborhood or a whites-only public space. And they are the last line of defense. Insofar as they are the force that would show up to defend white supremacy from the civil rights movement, which was attempting to dismantle it. Therefore, in the name of goodness and justice and human dignity, perhaps, the Jim Crow police needed to be driven out of these black neighborhoods where they had inflicted so much pain and so much suffering for generations. Moreover, if you're living under a constant state of violence, the question about the wrongness of resorting to political violence yourself doesn't always even make sense. So here's Angela Davis discussing that same point.
And then you ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. What it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
Now, separate from the ethical question of whether or not property destruction and riotous violence can be morally justified, there's the question of whether or not property destruction and riotous violence can be an effective political tool. And in particular, the question, was the Birmingham Rebellion an effective political tool? And the answer to this question, I think, is quite clearly yes. The uprising is perhaps the clearest possible refutation of what can be one of the most harmful lies of the last 60 years. The idea that real change comes from peaceful protest. What history do we have to demonstrate that real change comes from peaceful protest? There's very little, in fact, right? And, on the other hand, what evidence do we have that the riot in Birmingham was actually effective? Well, for this, we look back to the president at the time, JFK. After the uprising in Birmingham, he gives a televised address to the nation declaring his administration's support for civil rights.
But in too many communities, in too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens, and there are no remedies at law. Unless the Congress acts, their only remedy is the street. I am therefore asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments.
JFK had made no such commitment to send civil rights legislation to Congress to begin to dismantle Jim Crow. His administration was known for kind of stalling on the question of civil rights and dragging their feet on it, treating it as simply just a legal concern for the courts to handle and not a moral, ethical concern. And he had not made such a commitment to civil rights after the police were using dogs on children or using water hoses, right? He didn't make such an address until after there was the violence of the riot, of the rebellion. The change in policy happened because of the rebellion, and this is a history that we were never really allowed to learn. Now, a month later, JFK is assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson comes to office, and he actually passes the 1963 Civil Rights Act. So, to state matters even more clearly, the riot in Birmingham accomplished in 2 days what the previous 2 years of nonviolent civil disobedience could not accomplish: the passing of federal civil rights legislation. Now, again, that's not easy to hear, which is precisely why we've never heard it. So, what's more evidence for this? Well, we can turn to the Kennedy tapes. Kennedy used a recording device to document his conversations in the Oval Office. And I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to review the full exchange between President Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, his brother, the Attorney General, in the text itself. But here is the most important moment of this exchange. This is John F. Kennedy and his brother discussing the Birmingham riot as it's going on May 12th. Robert F. Kennedy says, "You're going to have rallies all over the country calling on the president to take some forceful action, and why aren't you protecting the rights of the people in Birmingham and the feeling of the Negroes generally and the reports we get from other cities, not just the South, that the uprising in Birmingham, could trigger off a good deal of violence around the country, with Negroes saying they've been abused for all these years, and they're going to follow the ideas of the black Muslims now, right? Malcolm X." John F. Kennedy he continues, "If they feel, on the other hand, that the federal government is their friend, that it's intervening for them, that it's going to work for them, then it will head off some of that violence that's going to spread," right? I think that's the strongest argument for doing something. So that's still Robert F. Kennedy, actually. Then JFK responds, "First, we have to have law and order so the Negroes not running all over the city. If the local Birmingham desegregation agreement blows up, the other remedy we have under that condition is to send a legislation to Congress this week as our response to the action happening. As a means of providing relief, we have to have civil rights legislation." In other words, it wasn't the nonviolent civil disobedience, it wasn't the marches, it wasn't the sit-ins, which were impactful and successful, right? That wasn't the direct trigger for the civil rights legislation. The direct trigger for the civil rights legislation was the 2-day riot by people who refused to be pacified and who tried to drive the police out of their neighborhoods and set fire to police vehicles and looted and burned down a couple of buildings. All right, that'll be the end of this lecture. I'll hope to have another few videos up soon. Thanks.